Most of us view childhood as something left behind once we reach adulthood. We think of it as faded photographs and distant memories that maturity should help us move past. Yet Jung discovered something that challenges this assumption completely. There exists within each grown person a child that never left. This isn't merely symbolic or nostalgic, but represents an actual psychological presence that remains active in our adult minds. This internal figure shapes our thoughts, influences our choices, affects our relationships, and even defines who we become. Jung identified this as the archetypal child, a force that doesn't sleep or fade with time. Instead, it operates beneath our awareness, carrying both our purest qualities like wonder and creativity, along with our deepest wounds from rejection, abandonment, and invalidation. Through his clinical work, Jung noticed that much adult distress stems from suppressing this inner presence. Rather than acknowledging and caring for it, we learn to conceal it behind masks of maturity and social roles. This denial exacts a heavy toll through anxiety, emptiness, relationship struggles, and repeating destructive patterns. The crucial insight is that ignoring this child doesn't make it vanish. Denial only drives it deeper, causing it to emerge in disguised and chaotic ways. Adults who overreact to minor slights feel perpetually unseen, constantly seek approval, or struggle with boundaries often aren't being immature. They're being guided by a wounded aspect that has never been truly recognized. Jung's most profound point is that this child doesn't require fixing like a defect. It needs recognition and a rightful place within the adult mind. Genuine psychological growth happens not by rejecting the inner child, but by developing what Jung termed the internal parental function, the capacity to care for yourself from within, and establish dialogue between wounded and protective aspects of yourself. This marks the start of real emotional maturity. Not suppressing pain, but truly hearing it. Not faking strength, but building genuine solidity. This exploration invites you to revisit this forgotten dimension of your psyche. Your inner child isn't an obstacle to adult life, but rather the gateway to authenticity, creativity, and emotional freedom. Understanding this isn't merely therapeutic. It's essential for psychic survival in a world demanding increasing self-disconnection. Perhaps by meeting the eyes of the child you were and remain, you'll finally understand your exhaustion, confusion, and deep longing. The answers were never external. They've always resided within, small and sensitive and waiting to be seen. Jung understood archetypes not as abstract concepts, but as living psychological structures inhabiting the collective unconscious. They shape behavior, perception, and emotion with power transcending logic. Among these, few impact us as deeply as the inner child. What Jung identified wasn't nostalgic childhood memory, but an active psychological entity, an emotional energy center persisting within us regardless of age. This inner child doesn't exist trapped in the past. It manifests now in our reactions, desires, irrational fears, and how we relate to the world. People often think of childhood memories when discussing the inner child. But Jung proposed something deeper. The child symbolizes the self in formation, representing both the beginning of the individuation journey and untapped transformative potential. It embodies simultaneous vulnerability and sacredness. Within lies the essence of spontaneity, sensitivity, curiosity, and creativity, alongside the deepest wounds, unprocessed trauma, helplessness, shame, and abandonment feelings. This internal presence subtly yet devastatingly influences adult behavior. When ignored, it manifests through disproportionate responses, emotional outbursts, irrational insecurities, abandonment fears, constant approval seeking, difficulty handling criticism or frustration. Many adults spend entire lives guided by this wounded aspect, regardless of their leadership roles, established families, or successful public images. The inner child respects no status, it simply wants to be heard. This archetype carries ambiguous character. It can bridge our healing or source our greatest imbalances. When integrated, we access creativity, intuition, and lightness. When repressed, we sabotage everything we build. Jung considered this one of the unconscious's most vital elements. He stated that ignoring the inner child resembles amputating part of the soul, and any personal or spiritual development excluding this reconnection is destined to fail. Not all inner children manifest identically. Jung observed different forms with distinct needs and distortions. Some control silently, others scream desperately for attention, but all exert influence. Jung didn't simply identify the inner child as a singular phenomenon. Through clinical study, he recognized this archetype takes multiple expressions within adults, each carrying specific needs, strengths, and distortions. These aren't rigid categories, but interpenetrating patterns forming the invisible foundation of our behaviors. Understanding these manifestations is essential for recognizing where our most automatic and painful adult reactions originate. The first is the wounded child, carrying explicit and implicit trauma, abandonment, rejection, emotional neglect, violence, chronic invalidation of feelings. This child learned early that expressing needs was dangerous, seeking attention was humiliating, and trust led to pain. When unintegrated, the wounded child manifests in adults as intimacy fear, chronic anxiety, codependent patterns, emotional hypervigilance, difficulty trusting, and persistent emptiness no external achievement can fill. It makes us react to criticism as existential attacks, perceive rejection where none exists, and repeat self-abandonment cycles. The second manifestation is the eternal child. While the wounded child lives in past pain, the eternal child lives in escape. This part refuses to mature, accept responsibilities, or endure frustrations. It seeks constant novelty, immediate pleasure, effortless admiration, and viscerally fears limits or commitments. In adults, this appears as chronic procrastination, unstable relationships, routine aversion, difficulty building long-term achievements, or feeling that adulthood is imprisonment. Jung viewed this not as moral failing, but as sign that childhood's vital energy hadn't found mature expression. The third is the divine child, representing our deepest creative, spiritual, and intuitive potential. This part still believes in existence's mystery, experiencing life as sacred and full of possibility. It sources our insight, genuine compassion, and capacity for wonder. Ironically, this child often suffocates beneath the pain of the other two. Without space to emerge, it withdraws and becomes inaccessible, leaving adults disconnected from creativity and purpose. Jung believed most people live predominantly under the wounded child's dominion, reacting from emotional lack and survival states. We seek in romantic partners the parents we never had, react to criticism as personal rejections, and create patterns unconsciously repeating our childhood stories. This dynamic isn't weakness. It's a powerful archetype operating without awareness. Recognizing these three manifestations isn't intellectual exercise, but a key to deep self-knowledge. When we can identify which child is in charge at any moment, we take the first step toward regaining control of our psychic life. But first, we must understand how we were taught from early age to hide this inner child behind social roles and masks, a mechanism seeming protective but actually causing illness. From earliest years, we learn certain emotions are unwelcome. Feeling too much signals weakness. Crying is ugly. Depending on others is shameful. Being overly sensitive is flawed. As years pass, this emotional education marked by repression and symbolic punishment teaches us to wear masks, strength, control, independence, maturity. We create a socially acceptable self designed to please, function, and avoid rejection. But this self often becomes an empty shell, built on systematic denial of the child still living within us. Jung observed that suppressing the inner child under the guise of maturity is central to modern psychological suffering. Repression doesn't eliminate pain, it displaces it. What consciousness tries to ignore, the unconscious stores. Repressed anger becomes anxiety. Ignored needs become compulsion. Stifled vulnerability emerges as addiction, sabotage, psychosomatic illness. Instead of healing wounds, we become experts at masking them. These masks take various forms. There's the responsible adult mask, always caring for others but never themselves, often guided by an inner child who learned they only deserve love when useful. There's the strong and invulnerable mask, needing no one, never crying, solving everything alone, whose inner child was forced to mature too quickly. There's also the successful mask, constantly achieving and performing, but exhausted, trying to prove worth to parents who may never truly saw them. These masks are unconscious attempts to ensure emotional safety in a world that punished vulnerability. The problem is, they distance us from our authentic selves, creating gaps between who we truly are and what we show the world. The greater this distance grows, the more we feel emptiness. An emptiness we try filling with consumption, distraction, numbing relationships, or superficial spirituality. But nothing replaces psychic truth. The inner child doesn't disappear with time. It waits to be recognized, heard, embraced. Until that happens, it sabotages. Not from malice, but because that's the only language it knows to get our attention. Many adults spend decades in this cycle, ignoring the inner child in maturity's name and reaping as consequence a depleted emotional life, superficial relationships, and recurring existential crises. They believe they need to be stronger, more productive, more rational, when actually the opposite is needed: sensitivity, listening, presence. Someone within them capable of caring for the child, never cared for. An internal protective and nurturing figure. This is precisely what Jung called the internal parental ego, the psychic instance allowing adults to become, for themselves, the parent they never had. This is true healing's beginning. If the inner child is a living, active force within us, how can we coexist without being dominated by its wounds? Jung's answer is profound, yet surprisingly practical. It's not about repressing the child, but developing an adult within who knows how to care for it. Jung termed this the internal parental ego, a psychic instance functioning as internal parents, capable of embracing, protecting, and offering what the wounded child never received from the external world. Contrary to common belief, emotional maturity isn't about abandoning the inner child, but creating relationship with it. This requires something few truly develop: conscious self-welcoming. The internal parental ego is this ability to become self-observer, noticing when the wounded child controls, and instead of reacting impulsively or repressing, establishing internal dialogue. Saying internally, "I see your pain. I am here. I will not abandon you." This simple psychic stance has revolutionary impact. Consider an everyday situation. Someone rejects or criticizes you. You feel disproportionate reaction, anger, deep sadness, or sudden urge to withdraw and isolate. Instead of simply reacting, the parental ego activates. It recognizes that not the adult suffers, but the wounded child, reliving in that moment, old pain of abandonment or invalidation. By doing this, you completely change the internal dynamic. You shift from reactive mode to active self-care state. This process is the core of true psychological maturity. It's not about becoming cold, distant, or indifferent to emotions, as many confuse with being adult. It's exactly opposite. It's developing an internal presence that knows how to contain pain without identifying with it. Being simultaneously the child who feels and the adult who cares. This integration transforms the fragmented psyche into functional psyche. But this doesn't happen solely through rational awareness. The parental ego needs cultivation. It requires practice, intention, and above all, commitment to emotional truth. Many try healing childhood pain only through reading, meditation, or conventional therapy. All help, but don't replace the internal work of learning to care for oneself as a good parent would care for a sensitive child. This enters the territory of reparenting, the process of offering the inner child what was never given. Most believe that time heals childhood wounds, that growing up, becoming independent, and gaining emotional autonomy suffice to overcome the past. But the truth is more brutal. Time heals nothing that continues being ignored. The inner child's wounds remain open, not in memory, but in the body, relationships, automatic reactions, and patterns repeating across generations. That's why Jung proposed a radical and profoundly transformative path: reparenting. Reparenting yourself means consciously becoming the adult you needed as a child. It's not about returning to the past, reliving traumas indefinitely, or getting lost in lamentations. It's about building, in the present, a real relationship with the most sensitive and wounded part of your psyche, and doing for it what original caregivers, due to limitation, ignorance, or trauma, could not do. This includes offering emotional validation, internal safety, clear boundaries, and above all, permission to exist as you are. This process begins with listening, deep listening. Not intellectual listening, trying to understand pain with logic, but emotional listening that embraces what arises without trying to correct it. The inner child doesn't want fixing. It wants recognition. It wants to know its pain makes sense, its fear isn't madness, its need for love wasn't excessive. The reparented adult isn't the one who became invulnerable, but who knows how to handle their own vulnerability without self-betrayal. Reparenting also involves establishing internal boundaries. Often the inner child seeks in others what the conscious adult hasn't yet learned to offer. It seeks protection in dysfunctional relationships, validation in social media, love in bonds where it needs to diminish itself for acceptance. Learning to say no to these impulses isn't rejection, but protection. It's like saying, you no longer need to beg for love. I am here. I care for you now. Another fundamental aspect is practicing emotional self-regulation. This means developing ability to calm oneself, offer presence in crisis moments, comfort oneself without resorting to compulsion or escape. These are simple yet powerful acts. Stopping to breathe when anxiety arises, writing to oneself as if consoling a real child, choosing to distance from toxic environments even if it hurts. Each action sends a silent but decisive message to the unconscious. I will not abandon you anymore. Over time, this process begins changing something very deep. The wounded child stops screaming because it's finally being heard. Impulsive reactions decrease because now an adult is present in command. Relationships change because emptiness no longer demands filling at any cost. The energy once trapped in defenses and repetitions begins circulating freely, and with it, creativity, sensitivity, and genuine desire to live return. This is true healing's essence, not erasing the past, but creating a present where old pain finds acceptance. Reparenting yourself is, at its core, a revolutionary act. It's saying the story doesn't end where it was interrupted, that there's a new possibility, not to rewrite what happened, but to radically change how it lives within you today. But there's something even more powerful that happens when this inner child stops being carried as burden and begins being recognized as guide. It transforms. Something profound happens when, after years or decades, the inner child is finally heard. The pain that once manifested as chronic anxiety, emotional addictions, destructive relationships, and insatiable void begins slowly dissolving. What emerges from this process isn't just relief, it's power. Not aggressive or performative power, but silent strength arising from reconnecting with parts of yourself that were exiled. When this child is no longer treated as problem and is recognized as essential aspect of your being, it stops acting in shadows. It no longer needs sabotaging your life to get attention. It doesn't need screaming inside you every time someone rejects, criticizes, or ignores you, because now it knows it's no longer alone. There's an adult there, a present, protective, available adult. An adult who learned to love, not because it was taught, but because it chose not to repeat abandonment. At this point, something almost magical happens. Pain gives way to creativity. Lack makes room for real connection. Anxiety transforms into presence. When the inner child feels safe, it reveals its highest face, the divine child, the one unafraid to feel, create, explore, be enchanted, the one carrying within life's deepest meaning. Jung said the child is a symbol of wholeness. When integrated, the human being stops living fragmented, divided between persona and shadow, between what's shown to the world and what suffers in silence. True freedom begins when you no longer need fighting against yourself, when you no longer need wearing masks to deserve love, nor shrinking to be accepted, when you become the very home you've always sought in others. This is the turning point. It doesn't come from outside. It doesn't come from courses, relationships, or empty promises. It comes from the radical gesture of looking inward with courage and saying, I see you. I am here for you. I will not abandon you anymore. This is the beginning of a new life, a life more whole, more true, more light. A life in which you no longer need to survive. You can finally live.